Alrighty, what's going on, boys and girls? So we're here with a reaction video. I know it's been a while since I've done one of these. I haven't really done one since the LTT thing, and there have been reasons for that, mostly work related as far as keeping busy and whatnot. But this particular video is entitled, Should I Switch to Linux? This guy has about 650,000 subscribers, so I'm curious to see what Homeboy's take is. I guess we'll find out. I'm going to guess he's probably either a Mac or a Windows user, like strictly Mac Windows user. I could be wrong, but we'll see. So let's roll into this and see how well Homie does and whether or not his approach is reasonable or not.
Windows 11 is now being rolled out, and as with every other time Microsoft have released a new version of Windows, the Linux fanboys have crawled out of their basements to tell everyone they should upgrade to Linux instead. Well, here's my laptop. Let's see if they have a point.
So the first thing, the sarcasm, I'm fine with. Some Linux fanboys, in fairness, are going to probably take a little bit of a, be a little fucking butthurt about that. But hey, whatever, that's their prerogative. I really don't care. You know, this is being done on Linux that I'm doing this on with OBS. So yeah, there's that too.
Welcome back to the Pro Tech Show. To avoid any overly generic interpretations of this video, I'm considering my specific use case on my specific laptop. That doesn't mean the answer will be the same for everybody. To set the scene then, my laptop is a secondary device. I don't do my main work on it or edit my videos on it. I do normal person stuff with it. Browsing the internet, checking my emails, editing a few documents, calling family, watching a bit of YouTube. If you've watched the channel before, you'll know I'm not new to Linux. In fact, some of the most popular content on this channel is about Linux. But I don't consider myself a full-blown expert, and I actually have relatively little experience of Linux on the desktop.
So just anybody who's in Linux will never consider themselves a quote-unquote expert. No expert actually considers themselves an expert, because if the day you stop learning is the day you're dead.
Most of my experience is on servers, and servers tend to look like this. I've used Linux desktops, sure, you've seen me do it. But there's a difference between logging on to perform a discrete task and actually living with it day in day out on your personal device. The last time I did that was about 15 years ago, and yes, now I feel old, thanks. I think this puts me in an interesting position to review the modern Linux desktop experience though. There will be some issues, but I'm familiar enough with Linux that I ought to be able to work my way around most of them. I won't run away when I see a terminal. However, when something doesn't quite work in desktop land, I will have to actually troubleshoot it. Hopefully this means I can give you a balanced viewpoint. The distro I chose was Fedora. I like Red Hat and its derivatives and servers, but they're focused on server use cases and a bit slow moving. Fedora is more cutting edge and has more packages readily available, so I think it makes a lot of sense for a desktop install. I don't think it's stable enough for server use. I've had a few minor crashes over the past couple of weeks, so I'm sticking with Red Hat or derivatives like Rocky or Alma Linux on servers.
So the one thing I do like what he's doing is he's using what he knows and goes with that. People like Linus can learn a thing or two. Just saying, like that's been my biggest gripe with Linus is he refuses. His approach is just ass. I like this. This is more balanced based off prior experience and the knowledge in that experience. And I think that's the right way to go.
But Fedora is fine for the desktop. How did it fare compared to Windows though? Well, it had its ups and its downs. I'm going to attempt to plot them on a graph as we go so you can keep track. Right away, Linux gets a point for just working, without whinging at me about unsupported processors. It's a low bar to set, but it beats Windows 11 on my 4.5-year-old laptop. It gains another point for the install process. The ability to run live off the USB to check your device actually works with it is a handy touch, and the setup process was much less annoying than Windows. I'm not convinced it was any faster than Windows, but it didn't keep stopping to ask me questions. The Windows setup process peaked about Windows Vista when it got mouse support, and now these days it seems to spend less time actually installing Windows than it does trying to get your consent for data harvesting. Linux just got on with installing the operating system, which is all I wanted it to do.
So the thing that a lot of us like when it comes to that particular area is a lot of us like the fact that it just goes. It's not a lot of nonsense. So for a lot of us, anyway, it boils down to I can have a OS up and running in 20 minutes, as opposed to Windows. It constantly asked about harvesting your data and then spend how many times installing your apps unless you're using something like Ninite. But what if Ninite doesn't have it? Then if you end up having to download all the stupid updates, depending how old your ISO is and blah, 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 and all the other stuff. And it's just a hassle. It's really, really annoying. So that's what a lot of us like, because it makes distro hopping really easy. And yeah, the live USB, allowing people to test their hardware before to see if it actually works. Novel idea. Something Microsoft might want to try with Windows 11 if, they could, but apparently they can't.
Once installed, our happy graph starts to take a nosedive as we begin setting up all the additional pieces needed to make it work properly. This is one area where Linux struggles. It shouldn't be a major issue if you know your way around Linux, but the sort of problems I encountered are what puts newbies off using Linux. I think it's important to call these out because people are shouting on the internet that everyone should switch to Linux. It's really easy and you don't need any technical skills. I don't agree. There are benefits of moving to Linux, but you do need at least a willingness to learn some technical skills, because it's only a matter of time before you hit a problem that leads you to typing commands into the terminal. If you don't understand what you're doing at this point, then you're just pasting commands from random people on the internet, often with root privileges, and that's dangerous.
So, first off, this is where distro choice does matter. People that are yelling from the rooftops about using X, Y, or Z distro should be taking the use case of the person they're making those recommendations to into mind when they make a distro recommendation. I'm a guru to Linux guy, so by the way, I use Arch. Ha ha ha. But I'm going to recommend, a elementary or a deepin or something along those lines that is it's more familiar from a UI perspective. It's more pointy and click, more app store driven, that's just where the modern world has landed. So you have to kind of tailor that experience to the person you're making those distro recommendations to. I would never tell someone to use Octopi, or at least the Qt version, for installing apps. There's too much wasted crap in there. Then there's the best one, honestly, to me, is probably PawMac, because it has a software only mode. So it gets rid of like all the libraries and all that stuff. So you don't see a lot of that stuff. Reception kind of matters. I will say, though, the one thing I will take issue with is I'm not discounting the experience that you're giving. I'm going to discount that the experience you're giving is based off one distro so far. I'm not saying you haven't tried other distros currently, but you said Fedora. So I'm not going to judge everything. You can't judge everything in Linux based off that one experience of one distro. You talked about, the exploring and open-mindedness and willingness. You have to understand that with a distro as well. Because sometimes you have to make a distro, making the distro fit the hardware is not the right way to go about it. Again.
For example, I want my hard drive to be encrypted, but I want it to unlock automatically on boot. The laptop has a TPM, so this should be perfectly possible, and it works in Windows right out of the box. Enabling the encryption was just a tick box during the install, so top marks there. But setting up TPM unlock was a bit more of a mission. To do this, I need to install some additional software and run a few commands at the terminal. The final series of steps look something like this. A few things of note. These commands are only there to work around a bug. This isn't something I've done before, so I was following online guides. I kept getting errors, but it turned out to be a known issue with this package. The package isn't necessary at this stage though, so I could work around the problem by uninstalling it, setting up the TPM decryption, and reinstalling it. Another thing of note are these numbers. Different guides suggested different numbers. The numbers refer to methods of checking the system hasn't been tampered with. Any combination would have worked, but most of the guides didn't tell you this and just said, copy these numbers. No explanation as to what they were or why they differed in other guides, which I think people will find confusing. This line was missing from a lot of guides, but it won't work without it. And this piece here was again different in different guides, with no explanation as to why. Of course, it's your hard drive partition, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that the guide I was using didn't say that. It said this. I saw that, knew my laptop doesn't have an NVMe drive, and changed it appropriately. But think about your average Windows computer user. Do they know what type of drive they have?
Your average Windows computer, you're talking mom and pop, they use Windows as a tool, they don't understand what an OS is, they just know it's a pointy clicky thing. They're not going to understand that what the hell a TPM module is. They're not going to understand what the hell encrypting the hard drive or your SSD or NVMe drive is. So you can't apply that one experience in your particular use case to a broad range. I'm not saying it discounts the experience that you had, but your one experience does not apply to everybody else that is not in the same level technically that you are. You're applying your technical knowledge to a group that doesn't have it potentially. I'm not saying some of them don't, but most won't. So I do take issue with that.
Would they even know that's what this line of text refers to? I think not. I think they'd copy-paste the command, it wouldn't work, and they'd just assume Linux is broken. On Windows, this entire process is automatic and requires zero knowledge. Until Linux is as easy as that, it's going to remain a niche platform for techies, and the year of Linux on the desktop will never arrive.
Again, you're applying your one particular situation, which is a more technically oriented situation than most average, as your terms, Windows users aren't gonna fucking know. I'm not like, that's just what it is. Most, unless you're a Windows power user where you go and regedit everything to make Windows not do stupid crap that it does, then mom and pop aren't going to care about a TPM module. Just saying. So for you, totally valid point. Applying that point to a group it does not apply to, generally speaking, because you're generalizing with average Windows, and I use this term as you did, average Windows users, or I point, I click, it goes. That's the mentality of most of that group.
Besides, after doing all of this, the laptop still prompted me for a decryption password anyway. That turned out to be a bug as well. The TPM did actually release the key correctly, and it did decrypt the drive, and the operating system was booting the whole time behind the password screen. If I just waited, then once Fedora got to login screen, the password box suddenly disappeared. Fine once you know, but I wasted a lot of time troubleshooting a non-issue. It also had problems with screen.
No, it's an issue for you. See, you just said it was a non-issue. It was a non-issue for most users anyway. It was an issue for you. It doesn't discount your experience. But again, you're applying, there's a fallacy in your logic that you're applying this particular instance to everything, to another group that it doesn't apply to. Average Windows user, you are a technical Windows user. You are a quote unquote Windows power user. You don't fall into that category.
Screen rotation not working until I manually modified the chassis type so GNOME would believe it was in fact a convertible device. On the upside, whilst GNOME may rather stupidly rely on a hard-coded list of device models and ignore the actual hardware signals to say, hey, this is in tablet mode, at least Linux actually lets me change stuff like this. The final issue I had was getting my printer to work. Isn't it always a printer? Fedora came with drivers for it, but they didn't work. I got the driver from the manufacturer, but it had dependencies, and those dependencies weren't in any of the normal repos. When your software is in the repos, Linux package management is awesome. When it's not, installing software is a bollock, because now you're on an internet-wide treasure hunt to find all of the missing pieces. Now let's talk.
You mean like you're on an internet-wide treasure hunt to find all your individual updated stuff for drivers when Windows updates them? You know, stuff like, oh, what's that program a lot of people, Driver Booster? When your platform still requires that, the other platform doesn't have much to say about it. I'm just saying. And printers have their own issues on Mac, Windows, or Linux. Because printer OEMs just make shitty drivers. They're kind of like the old ATI drivers. They were just shitting on every platform.
Talk about actually using the desktop. I didn't like the default GNOME experience. I know this is a bit subjective, but just look at the experience of switching between programs. When you minimize anything, it disappears into a dock that's then hidden from view unless you jump out of your workspace and into the Activities menu. You can hit the Windows key to make this quicker, or you could Alt-Tab through. But if you intend to use the mouse, which is a perfectly reasonable and normal thing to do, look at how it's laid out. The Activities button is all the way up here. The dock is all the way down here. You can't just click from one program to the next like you would in Windows or Mac. You end up jumping your mouse from one side of the screen to the other. Back and forth, back and forth. Who designed this?
I'm no GNOME guy, trust me. I use Plasma for a reason. However, in this particular instance, hit the fucking Windows key, Super key, Meta key, Command key, whatever you want to call it, and it'll do magical things. Like bring up the Activities menu, and then you can Alt-Tab right through whatever the hell you need to. Or you can click on the pretty GUI interface with a mouse and go back to what you need to. Or you can just go down to the dock and click the thing that was just minimized.
Fortunately, it is really easy to add extensions to tweak behavior. Installing Dash to Dock kept the dock visible when I need it. That massively improved the user experience for me. You can make the entire thing look and behave like Windows without too much effort, but I don't want to emulate Windows. I wanted to try the vanilla GNOME experience, just not quite so sucky. For me, adding Dash to Dock and switching on the Minimize and Maximize buttons took it from a clunky experience to a smooth one. This ease of customization is a major advantage of Linux, and it regains some points here because although I think the out-of-the-box experience is a bit clunkier than Windows, by the time you've done just a little bit of tweaking, it should be a better experience in Windows. I don't even think that statement is subjective. At the very least, you can make it behave the same as Windows, so it can't be worse. The real beauty of it is that you can tweak it to complement your own particular way of working, and no one-size-fits-all solution is ever going to be as good as that.
And that right there, no one-size-fits-all solution, is exactly why there are Linux users. That's why there's, all the distros that people complain about. That's exactly why they're there. Because no one-size-fits-all works for everybody. The way I have Plasma set up is not the same way as some of the Linux user will have Plasma set up that as a Plasma user. That's the beauty of it. GNOME, they have I wouldn't rely on extensions too much if you know the politics of that. So
okay, so using Linux is actually pretty good. How about performance? There's more good news. My laptop felt noticeably snappier under Fedora than it had been under Windows 10. It had been starting to struggle and Fedora gave it a new lease of life. To make things fair, I also tested a fresh install of Windows 11, and that did improve things as well, so my old install clearly had a bit of the old Windows rot setting in. I'm therefore not going to outright say Linux performed better than Windows, but I will allow it to pick up another point because I do believe it will at least maintain its performance better over time. Windows just seems to get a bit more bloated over time, a lot of which I put down to its lack of proper package management. If you want an example, install Visual Studio, then remove it, and look at how much CRUD gets left behind because it's not sure if a program might need it or not. It's why I tend to do clean installs rather than upgrades. The Windows in-place upgrade process is fairly reliable these days, but it's an opportunity to get rid of the junk. Speaking of package management, Linux dumps on Windows from near fatal heights here. It's so much better. It kind of needs to be, because with Linux being essentially patched together from hundreds of independently developed packages, if you don't have robust package management in place, then you end up with dependency hell like I had with my printer. I knew it was better going in. Like I said, I'm not new to Linux. Using it on the desktop really drives home just how much better it is. On a Linux server, you can tell your package manager to run an update and that's it, everything gets updated. On a Windows server, you tell Windows to run an update and Windows gets updated. You still need to update the application separately and maybe its database too. It's more work than Linux, but it's not like the Windows experience is unusable. Servers tend to be single-function machines though. On the desktop, if you have 30 applications installed in Windows, that's probably 30 different update procedures.
Yeah.
Seriously, patching everything on a Windows desktop is a pain in the backside. Linux? One command. One single command. And the thing is, I installed Microsoft software on Linux.
I got one better. One single button. Instead of the command, the button. You talked about average Windows users and the package manager. They're going to use GNOME software or insert software store here with the big pointy clicky interface. So maybe instead of talking about commands and copy and pasting commands, which I abhorrently hate, and the documentation that does specifically just that should die in a burning fire of hell, personally, there boils down to, if you're going to talk average, go to the average area, average Windows user would go. And it's either going to be go to a website and download a equivocal app image, app image, flatback snap, whatever, insert package format here. Or show them, hey, here's a store. Kind of different. So you're not the average, bruh. You're the exception. The average, they're not going to type one simple command. They're going to hit the meta key, super key, Windows key, command key, whatever you want to call it, and type in whatever the name of the something software, add remove software, whatever, and it will bring them to a software center, software store, call it whatever you want there. And then they'll search the things, and they'll click the install button, and it'll install. And it might even do updates for them too, when it gives them a nice little pop-up on the bottom that says, you have updates.
My goal, remember, is to upgrade my laptop, not to switch my entire workflow over to open source. So on Linux, I installed Skype because that's what my family uses to talk to their grandchildren. I installed Visual Studio Code because I'm trying to standardize on that a bit and sync it across devices. And I installed Microsoft Edge. I know you'll question that. Day to day when I'm working, there are some web apps I use that work best in Internet Explorer. I know, it's nearly 2022. I don't want to switch between multiple web browsers and I don't want to use Internet Explorer. So the best way for me to deal with that is to use Edge, which can open these silly old sites in IE mode and the proper internet in Chromium mode. Edge makes sense on Windows for that reason, and I've got my settings, my extensions, and my favourites set up on it. So the easiest thing to do on Linux is install Edge and sync them across. Turns out the best web browser for me on Linux is Microsoft Edge. Who'd have thought that would happen? The point is though, on Windows, Skype, VS Code and Edge all have different mechanisms for updating. Even though they're some of the better apps and have automatic updates, they're all different. On Linux, it's just DNF upgrade. One command handles all of them and the rest of the operating system as well. Why is Linux better at updating Microsoft apps than Windows is? Seriously, Microsoft, come on! So far Linux is looking pretty good. Once you've faffed about enough to get it working properly, it's slick, performs well, and it's easier to maintain. Now for some problems. Let's talk about standard office productivity tasks. Editing documents, checking my emails. Microsoft has this whole thing pretty well nailed down, so Linux was always going to struggle by comparison. But even with that expectation set going in, it wasn't a good experience. I essentially replaced Microsoft Office with LibreOffice and Evolution. And to me it felt like going about 20 years back in time. A lot of that was the look and feel. LibreOffice and Evolution look a lot more like Office 2000 or maybe 2003. Looks that don't equate to features, and for some people I'm sure they prefer it, but for me it was a step back. I found myself just using webmail instead. Ordinarily I hate using web apps, but OWA versus Evolution when the backend is Exchange, I couldn't warm to Evolution. A lot of the issues I had besides the user experience were less about Linux and more about the fact I was using Linux in conjunction with Windows. For example, one of my issues was OneNote. There is no OneNote client for Linux, so I was stuck with a web app, which is quite limited. There are alternative applications, but I have notebooks shared with other people, and I can't just ask them to change their applications because I want to use Linux on my laptop. I tried using LibreOffice, and initially things seemed to go well. I opened a document, edited it, saved it. But then I opened it up again on Windows and the formatting was completely screwed.
So formatting, check to see if it's ODF, check to see what format you saved it in. Usually the formatting, depending on specifically what you're talking about, because it could be Writer, it could be Calc, it could be insert LibreOffice application here. It all depends whether or not the um, sometimes it's the fonts that aren't installed, so it'll mess that up. There's a lot of different reasons that generically it'll get messed up. You don't have to be a live free or die hard kind of person when it comes to open source software, free software, whatever you want to call it. Most Linux users just use what works, bruh. So some software recommendations if you want something that's a lot more potentially compatible. I believe WPS Office is one of them. Kingsoft is another one. Or SoftMaker. Sorry, not Kingsoft. Kingsoft is WPS. There's only Office. There's other applications that have been updated within the last 20 years so that the GUI interface that you're going to be interacting with all the time doesn't make you want to bash your head off a wall because it looks like I went back 20 years, as you stated. I use WPS Office personally. So I get it. But I would definitely recommend looking at other things. It's not a all or nothing. I have to use LibreOffice. There are other things that are available. Try them. It's no different than when certain things in like Mac OS, like Pages and all the other stuff, or Google Docs. Yet people have no complaints about going over to those. So, and they're alternatives. They're different. They're not the same as insert Microsoft Office here. So explore the alternatives on the other platform that has stuff. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's the best solution. Sometimes it's finding the right solution. So here's a helpful hint. WPS Office, SoftMaker Office, Only Office. Those are probably going to be your best bets.
Again, it seems unfair to judge LibreOffice on its ability to edit Microsoft Office documents. If I was only using it for LibreOffice documents, I'm sure it would have been fine. But life isn't fair. Most of the rest of the world uses Microsoft Office, so if LibreOffice can't cope with it reliably, LibreOffice really isn't a lot of use to me. Linux lost a lot of points here because it seriously impeded my daily tasks. If I was working on Linux in isolation, it would have been okay, but that's not the world I live in. I need compatibility with everybody else, and everybody else is using Microsoft Office. The final problem I had was audio. It just sucked. The sound coming out of my laptop was awful. There was no bass and no high-end clarity either. It was like someone had dropped a bandpass filter on the audio and squeezed all of the frequencies. To be clear, my laptop speakers are nothing special. They're just average little laptop speakers, so I wasn't expecting studio quality audio. But it was bad. I can't bear to even watch YouTube videos like this. Bad. I don't think this is Linux's fault. If I plugged headphones in, it was fine. Linux was generating the right sounds, but the onboard speakers were definitely not right. This seems to be down to an application called Waves Max Audio Pro. In Windows, that gets installed automatically along with the audio drivers, and if I turn that off, it sounds just as bad. Dell and Waves have collaborated on this to improve the quality of the audio in this particular device, but there doesn't seem to be any support for Linux. At first, I assumed it was just doing some fancy equalization, so I figured I could tweak it myself, but it's not that simple. I installed EasyEffects and tried to target the bass first, as that was a rather obvious difference. EasyEffects has a preset for enhancing the bass, but switching it on did absolutely nothing. I thought EasyEffects wasn't working, but it was. I verified this with a manual EQ. It worked, until it got to about 2000 Hz. Anything I adjusted below 2 kHz had no effect because it just wasn't being played at all. I dropped every slider above 2 kHz, and it was like I'd hit the mute button. Nothing. The meters were jumping around, but the speakers were silent. It seems the Max Audio software is operating at the driver level to enable an additional hardware feature, and without it, the frequency range on the onboard speakers gets limited.
So, I get what you're saying, and that for you, totally valid reason it might not work for you. I will give you props for not blaming quote unquote Linux on that. You're pointing the finger in the right direction. It is a problem. I can't deny that. But you can also look at it and be like, well, why did Dell make this exclusive when they sell fucking Linux laptops? That's kind of a thing. So it's one of those things where, chicken, egg, call it whatever you want. That is a hardware specific problem. I'm not saying you should have specifically known that. My question is, did you, and this is not being a jackass, this is a legitimate question, did you actually run in live USB mode to test that stuff? Again, this is your experience with Fedora. There are a myriad of other distros, and I'm not saying distro hopping is the solution. I'm saying find the right distro for either your hardware or use case. That is the difference that I preach. Because making something square peg, round hole, using the triangle to bash in the square into the, circle is not going to work. So for me, I see these videos and I just kind of shake my head and it's like, right solution for you at the end of the day. And if the solution you tried didn't work, then cool. Go back to what did. Totally valid approach.
Fortunately, it's completely proprietary, and there doesn't seem to be any way of working around it. I tried Pipewire and Pulse Audio, I tried different distributions from the Red Hat, Debian and Arch families. I tried fiddling around with config files, I tried switching to Ubuntu and pointing at the Dell repos that they host for other laptops that they actually do support Ubuntu on, in case there's a compatible driver floating around in there somewhere. But every combination I tried,
and that I will give you a ton of respect for on that one, because you just basically nullified my entire point. Because that's the biggest thing. I was wondering if you were just testing Fedora and that was it. That shows that you actually tried other distros, so I'll give you props on that one.
had exactly the same issue. At this point, I've given up on fixing it. And this is where I come to my conclusion. Linux is more of a faff to get set up properly, but I expected that. Once set up, the user experience was actually pretty great, and it performed at least as good, if not better, than Windows. I found the productivity apps to feel dated, and there were some serious compatibility issues with my normal workflow. These compatibility issues and the terrible audio are what ultimately resulted in me installing Windows 11 instead. At the end of the day, if I can't do my day-to-day tasks or they take considerably longer to do, then it's not a viable option for me. So, is Linux on the desktop just a write-off then? No. I was very encouraged to see how far it's come since I last daily drove it. If I was using almost any other hardware, or if Dell actually bothered to support their devices on Linux properly, then the audio issue wouldn't exist. If I was using a device without proprietary secret sauce in its speakers, and if I wasn't so reliant on Microsoft Office, this laptop would currently be running Fedora. Would I recommend it to others though? If you have or are willing to learn a base level of technical skills to deal with Linux's foibles, you don't interact with Microsoft Office documents all that often, and you don't have a laptop that relies on proprietary Windows-only audio software, you should give Linux a go. It might surprise you. If you or people you work with are deep in the Microsoft ecosystem, or you just want an easy life, you're better off sticking with Windows.
I disagree with that last statement, as far as if you just want an easy life. Any OS has its problems. Mac OS, Linux, Windows, FreeBSD, take your pick. They'll have issues. I think you're not giving enough credence to that. Mom and pop come up and, hey son, can you, reinstall Windows? Can you fix our Windows, please? And they don't mean the ones attached to the house. They mean the one on their computer. It's not a short process. So I do take a little issue with that. I do like the fact that from what it sounded like towards the end there, that you did jump around and try different distros to actually see if it would fix your audio. Ton of props for that. Again, some of your other stuff was specific to Fedora, the workflows and kind of the GNOME stuff. Certain pieces and elements were very specifically the distro of choice. But honestly, I would have a recommendation of explore the alternatives more. And I don't mean the pre-installed ones. Just because they're pre-installed doesn't make them best. Is half the bloatware shit that's installed in most OEM laptops good? Fuck no. So don't assume just because it's on a Linux distro as a default that it's the best solution. That's sometimes not the case. Just my thoughts. overall, I agree on some of his points. I disagree. I think he generalizes with the average Windows user's mentality too much from somebody who is more than technical minded enough in Linux to know what to do to fix most stuff that most average Windows users wouldn't. So, is it good or bad? I do like the fact that it's an open-mindedness and an understanding that it's a different platform. As far as learning, again, the day you say you stop learning is the day you're dead. So I would prefer to keep on learning. So should everybody else, because that's what makes us better people.